I'm Jessica Moore. I'm the Collections Officer here at the Western Plains Cultural Centre, and today I'm going to be talking about controversial art. This presentation on controversy in art was part of a talk I gave during an exhibition that we had on street art. The exhibition called Space Invaders looked at street art, tagging, zines, graffiti, and naturally elicited some controversy when we displayed it here at Western Plains Cultural Centre. But what I'm going to hopefully explore today is how controversial art can be incredibly diverse, difficult at times to work out why in fact it's actually controversial, and at the end of the day argue that art is controversial not necessarily because of anything inherent in the artwork, but more because of the context in which it's shown. So the first work that I wanted to look at today was the portrait of Madame X by the American painter John Singer Sargent. This work is incredibly fascinating because from first impressions, when you look at the work, there's nothing inherently to our contemporary eyes that looks controversial about the work. This portrait, when it was first displayed, was incredibly shocking at the time. It was seen as sexually suggestive, it was seen as obscene, and almost ruined the career of the artist who made it. The original image actually had the straps of the lady's dress fallen down, which implied that she was in a state of undress, which for a late 19th century audience was confronting and shocking, and broke the rules of propriety at the time. So it's a really great example of an artwork that, in the context in which it was shown in the late 19th century in Paris, was breaking the rules of that time. But when we look at it now with contemporary eyes, with kind of the art history behind it, we look at this work and we no longer see it as controversial. So this is an example of a work that really shows us that it's the context in which the artwork is shown that makes it controversial, rather than there being anything inherently shocking or confronting or controversial in the artwork itself. There are also those works which seemingly break social convention in terms of the subject matter that they choose, and quite often it's in choosing to explore controversial issues in art that artists' work become controversial. For example, the work by Marcus Harvey called Myra, which is a giant portrait of the serial killer Myra Hindley. Now, the artist would have known going into this process that choosing that as a subject matter was going to elicit controversy, it was going to draw a lot of negative attention to the artwork. And so for an artwork like that, we have to question how much the artist is actually courting controversy and drawing attention to themselves, and whether that is being done in the aid of self-promotion, or whether it's actually drawing attention to bigger issues that a society might be not willing to look at. Another element of controversial art is where an artist chooses to use art as a form of political activism, whether that's to draw attention to civil liberties rights, feminist rights, gay and lesbian rights. And quite often these works are inherently controversial because they are intended to elicit a response. They're intending to shock us and make us aware of a particular issue. For example, there was a recent case in which the American artist David Wojnarowicz's work, Fire in My Belly, which was included in an exhibition at the Smithsonian looking at gay and lesbian portraiture. He was an artist who created a video piece that showed a crucifix being covered in ants. And this was about his own struggle with being homosexual and being Christian. And the work was pulled from the exhibition on the lobbying of religious groups. So in that sense, there is an inherent amount of controversy in an artwork when they are choosing to look at social or political issues, religious issues. And at times, often the controversy surrounding the artwork can draw more attention to it than if it had sort of not been pulled out as a work that people found shocking or confronting. There are also those works that become controversial because they are made by an artist or a culture whose views and society we find to be troubling. This is the example of work produced during Nazi Germany. A lot of the work produced, particularly by the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, has been influential on filmmakers in terms of her technique and her process of filmmaking, but the fact that she was filming Nazi party rallies and from a Nazi Party supported platform makes her work controversial and makes us question whether we can find value in art produced by dictatorial regimes or fascist regimes, and whether art can exist outside of these societies and be seen for its own intrinsic value. But inherently work produced by societies such as Nazi Germany is always going to have, in many ways, a sort of stain of the society upon it. One of the reasons that works often become labelled as controversial is that they break unwritten rules in art. There are expectations that we have of art, that they should be of certain subjects, be made from certain materials, and when an artwork seemingly breaks these rules, it's seen as controversial. The primary example of this is the seminal work by Edouard Manet, Luncheon on the Grass, in which he broke a whole lot of rules in terms of the way an image is composed, the way paint is applied, the way a subject matter is selected, and in doing so broke these unwritten rules. But without that work, without the shock to the system that work provided, we would not have had Impressionism, we would not have had modern art. So it's also a great example for that controversial works are rule breakers, but in doing so they actually are helping to progress and innovate in terms of art. So often works that are controversial may be at the time seen as crossing a line in art, but sometimes that line needs to be crossed for us to explore new potentials within art. In terms of looking at the work by Edouard Manet, I talked about this belief that people have in the inherent rules of art, and one of the accepted rules of art, or what we expect of art, is that we don't copy, that we don't replicate another artist's work. This was brought to light recently in Australia when the work by Sam Leach was kind of marked as the winner of the Wynne Prize a few years ago. And the controversy around that work was its similarity to a Dutch landscape of the 15th century. And there has been a lot of argument around that work as being simply a copy of the original Dutch master. But since the 1980s and 1990s with postmodernism, the idea that we can look to other sources, we can appropriate other sources in art, has become a very common trend within art. And so the artist himself argued that he was simply appropriating a style and that he altered the work enough to give it different context and different meaning. But it still inherently broke one of these unwritten rules about art, that we don't copy. And again, that's what made this work controversial.